Hello everyone. First, I would like to thank you for the 328 subscribers. So today I have gathered the 7 most terrifying stories about creepy neighbors. Before we start, more than 90% of viewers aren't subscribed to the channel, so please subscribe and hit the like button to encourage me to post more content. Now, turn off the lights and let's begin. Story 1. My neighbor has a habit of always trying to guess what I'm doing. It's gone from funny to terrifying. There must be some unwritten law of the universe that guides the relationships with your neighbors. I think I speak for everybody when I say that there's a specific type of dynamic you only get to have with them. Yeah, I know how you look like, but I can't say another thing about you. I have no idea what your last or first name is. Usually you only remember one of them. And I know where you live, obviously. But I couldn't name a single thing about your life. Yeah, I'd feel odd if you died, but I wouldn't necessarily feel bad. You get me? There's at least one neighbor you have this relationship with. For me, it is Mrs. Varelli. I did not give a fuck about her, and neither did she about me. We rarely met. I'm divorced in my 30s, and she's in her 60s. Often wakes up before I leave for work to walk her dog, and I never see her after dark. She looks bad. Her eyes are sinking into her face, and her hands are rotten and twitchy. A crooked nose, fragile, gray hair, almost balding if you asked me. She's a little mean. I greeted her once or twice, and she didn't respond at all. I only know her name because it's written on her mailbox in the building lobby, and I obviously didn't write it here. I changed some letters for anonymity. She lives above me. Sometimes she's really loud for an old lady. My guess is that she has her grandkids over, because I hear a lot of stomping at night. She also keeps her TV on at odd hours, blasting all kinds of channels. I have no idea what this lady likes to watch. Again, it makes sense for her to have grandkids over, since sometimes there's kids' channels blasting at full volume. My ceiling literally vibrates. Still, to put that on at 3 a.m.? She's kind of a shitty grandma. Once, I couldn't stand it anymore and yelled at her to fucking quit it. Hey, ma'am. I got up on the table and banged on the ceiling. Quit it. The fuck? The obnoxious music went on for another 10 to 15 seconds. Then it stopped. I remained on the table, waiting. Please stop blasting your shit at 4 in the morning. Sorry, I heard her. You banged on the ceiling? Yeah. Bet you had to jump on a table to do that? I found it funny. Yeah, actually. That's what anger'll do to you, ma'am. Since you're such a good guesser, what am I doing now? You jumped down, maybe tripped a little. Wrong, I'm still on the table. I was lying. I'd actually jumped down, but I didn't trip. She didn't answer. The loud TV never returned. Over the weeks, we started this funny banter thingy where she'd hear some bang and start to make guesses of what I'm doing. I found it ironic that I was half beefing with an old lady with a very deadpan sense of humor. You're gonna eat shredded cheese over the sink, then watch some weird young bullshit horror movie, then call it a night and go to sleep without brushing your teeth. Yeah, Grandma, that's exactly what I'll do. I'm surprised your hearing's so good after the war. Bet we have the same back problems. At least I have an excuse for that. I'd sometimes pass her in the lobby, and I'd whisper a, "Hey, Grandma." She looked around as if she was embarrassed to be seen with me. I found that hilarious. A few weeks passed, and at around 2 a.m., Mrs. Varelli's voice came from above. "Can't sleep, kitty?" "Don't call me kitty, Grandma. I'm not that old." "Yeah, you are." "Don't provoke me, Jay. I'll come down there to beat your ass." I'll use Jay for anonymity again. I'd like to see you trying. Silence. It went on for some time. I thought she'd gone to sleep then. I heard a knock at the door. No matter how you put it, a knock at the door at 2 a.m. can never be good. I was also a little freaked out by the possibility that my 60-year-old neighbor might have understood our banter a little wrong. I heard the knock again. I got up slowly, then creeped to the door. I knew I'd locked it, but I still had my doubts. The knock came again, teasing, playful. Bro, what the fuck, I remember thinking. You're pretending not to be home? Came the hushed, hoarse whisper. Something about it sent shivers down my spine. Hey, Mrs. Varelli? I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I'm not interested like that. A pause. Jay, do you honestly think I was into you? Oh, not at all. Just wanted to play a little hide and seek. Yeah, no thanks. Her voice was now a little stretched. My body was incredibly stiff. I slowly looked through the peephole and saw nothing. And yet, her voice came from behind the door. Hi, open the door. Let me guess. You're holding your breath? I stepped back, eyes wide open, throat dry. I wanted to say something, but the words died down. Then, she began to sing. The words were hushed and stretched out, filling the silence like a bad dream fills an innocent conscience. Quiet feet on bathroom tile mirror hold you for a while. Lights are off, but eyes still see. Something standing where you'd be? I was seriously shitting my pants by now. I stepped back as she continued. Click the lock and check it twice. Once for fear and once for nice. Shut the fuck up or I'll call the police. She stopped. I creeped back to the peephole and watched the hallway for what felt like hours, but I caught no movement. She either left before I could reach the peephole, literally sprinting or leaping to the stairs, or waited crouched down for hours. I didn't know what was creepier. I didn't sleep all night after that. As dawn creeped into my bedroom, I stared out the window and saw her casually walking her dog, as if she hadn't just terrorized the shit out of me. In the sunlight, she seemed almost normal, a regular old lady. Who would have guessed that she was batshit crazy during the night? When I knew she was gone, I finally got dressed and went to work. I was late, of course. I came back after dark and ran into another neighbor. We'll call her Sandra. I practically grabbed her. She was obviously paralyzed and stared into my eyes with a fear I'd never known. I hadn't realized how it looked like. I, a 36-year-old male, grabbing my 20-something neighbor and forcing her to look at me. Sandra, I'm sorry. I haven't slept all night. You know Mrs. Varelli? Her eyes tamed down a little. Yeah. She lives above you, sir? Yeah. Did she ever talk to you? She scared the shit out of me last night. Stopped at my door at 2 a.m. and started fucking singing. Sandra frowned. Mrs. Varelli? Yes, we sometimes talk through the walls. It sort of started when I banged on her ceiling to quit blasting the TV so loud, and I thought we became friends after that, but she's fucking crazy. She shook her head. The apartment above you? Yeah, isn't that where Mrs. Varelli lives? Old thin hair, walks her dog every morning? Yeah, but Mrs. Varelli is deaf and mute. You never noticed? She never said a word to us. She never hears us. Her daughter visited her like 2 years ago and told me that. There's no way you've been talking to her. Story 2. My neighbors say they've known my son for years. I've never had children. How old must he be now? 8? 9? I stared at my neighbor, unsure what she was asking. She read the confusion on my face. Your cute little guy. I saw him biking down the lane earlier. He must be old enough for grade 4 now, right? Mrs. Babbage was a bit on the older side, but I never thought she had shown signs of dementia. Not until now. I wasn't exactly sure what to say. She proceeded to stare at me, tilting her head, as if I was the one misremembering. I awkwardly opened my mouth. Oh, right. My little guy. She brightened. Yes, he must be in grade 4, right? Sure, yes, he is. What a cute little guy, she said, and returned to watering her flowers. It was an odd, slightly sad moment. I wondered if her husband had seen glimmers of this too. I could only hope that this was a momentary blip, and not the sign of anything Alzheimer's related. I took the rest of my groceries out of my car and entered home. I had a long day of teaching, and I just wanted to sit back, unwind, and watch something light on TV. But as soon as I took off my first shoe, I smelled it. Something burning on the stove. Something burning with lots of cheese on it. The hell? I dashed over to the kitchen and almost fell down, partially because I was wearing only one shoe, but also because there was a scrawny little boy frying Kraft dinner. I let out a half scream, but very quickly I composed myself into the same assertive adult who taught at a university. What? Excuse me? Who are you? What are you doing here? The boy's blonde, willow-like hair whipped around his face as he looked at me with equal surprise. Papa, what do you mean? I'm here. I'm here. He was a scared, confused child, and I couldn't quite place the bizarre inflection of his words. Do you want some KD, Papa? Have some, have some. Was that a Russian accent? It took me a second to realize he was wearing an oversized shirt that looked just like mine. Was he wearing my clothes? I held out my palms like I would at a lecture, my standard everyone settle down gesture, and cleared my throat. I'm sorry. I don't know who you are, or what this is. The boy widened his eyes, still frightened by my intensity. He stirred the food with a wooden spoon. It's Katie, Papa. Your favorite. Chili cheese kind. Don't you remember? His name was Dmitri, and he claimed to be my son. Apparently at some point there had been a mother, but he didn't remember much about her. He only remembered me. You've been Papa my whole life. My whole life, Papa. I tried having a sit-down conversation. In fact, I tried to have many sit-down conversations where I explained to Dmitri that that would be impossible. But it always ended with him clutching me with impassioned tears, begging me to remember him. The confusion only got worse when my mother called. How is my grandson doing? She asked. I didn't know how to reply. The conversation grew awkward and tense, until eventually I clarified my whole predicament. Mom, what are you talking about? I don't have a son. I've never had a son. My mother gasped a little, then laughed and scolded me, saying I shouldn't joke around like that, because of course I've always had a son, a smart little guy who will be celebrating 9 this weekend. I hung up. I stood petrified in my own kitchen, staring at this strange, expectant, Slavic child. For the next 10 minutes, all I could do was ask where his parents were, and he just continued to act frightened, like any authentic kid might, and replied with the same question. How did you forget me, Papa? My method wasn't getting me anywhere, so I decided to play along. I cleared my head with a shot of espresso. I told him my brain must have been scrambled from overworking, and I apologized for not remembering I was his father. He brightened immediately. It's okay, Papa, it's okay. He gave me a hug. You always work so hard. The tension dropped further as Dmitri finished making the noodles and served himself some. I politely declined and watched him eat, and he watched me watch him eat. So you're okay now? You're not angry? His accent was so odd. No, I said, I'm not angry. I was just a little scrambled. His eyes shimmered, looking more expectant. So we can be normal now? A wan chill trickled down my neck. I didn't really know what to say, but for whatever reason, I did not want to say yes, we can be normal now, because this was not normal. Far from it. This child was not my son. He started playing with his food and quivered a little, like a worried mouse seeking reassurance. Everything will be fine, I eventually said. No need to stress. Enjoy your noodles. To my shock and dismay, I discovered that Dmitri also had his own room. My home office had somehow been replaced by a barren clay-walled chamber filled with linen curtains, old wooden toys, and a simple bed. The smell of bread and earth wafted throughout. I watched him play with his blocks and spinning tops for about half an hour before he started to yawn and say he wanted to go to sleep. It was the strangest thing tucking him in. He didn't want to switch to pajamas or anything. He just sort of hopped into his straw bed and asked me to hold his hand. Dmitri's fingers were cold, slightly clammy little things. It was very bizarre, comforting him like my own son, but it appeared to work. He softened and lay still. He didn't ask for any lullaby or bedtime story. He just wanted to hold my hand for a minute. Thank you, Papa. I'm so glad you're here. So glad you can be my papa. Good night. I inched my way out of the room and watched him through the crack of his door. At about 9:30, he gave small, childlike snores. He had fallen asleep. Cautiously, I called Pat, my coworker with whom I shared close contact. She had the same reaction as my mother. Harlan, of course you have a son. From your marriage to Svetlana. My marriage to who? You met her in Moscow, when you were touring Europe. It was true that I had guest lectured 15 years ago across the UK, Germany, and Russia. I was awarded a grant for it. But I only stayed in Moscow for 3 days. I never met anyone named Svetlana. Don't be weird, Harlan, come on. Pat's conviction was very disturbing. You and Svetlana were together for many years. We were? How many? Look, I know the divorce was hard, but you shouldn't pretend your ex-wife doesn't exist. I'm not pretending, I'm being serious. I don't remember her. Then get some sleep. I sipped on my second espresso of the night. But I have slept. I'm fine. Well, then I don't get what this joke is. Knock it off. It's creepy. I'm not joking. I'll see you tomorrow for the birthday. Birthday? Yes, your son's birthday. Jesus Christ. Good night, Harlan. Get some sleep. I didn't sleep that night. My efforts were spent scouring the filing cabinets and drawers throughout my house. I had credit card bills covering school supplies, kids' clothing shops, and costlier groceries. I even had pictures of Dmitri hung around the walls from various ages. It's like everything was conforming to this new reality. The harder I looked for clues to disprove my fatherhood, the more evidence I found confirming it. It was Dmitri who woke me up off the living room couch and said Uncle Boris was here. Uncle Boris? I peeked through the window and could see a very large blonde man smiling back at me. Behind him was a gaggle of other relatives, all speaking Russian to each other. Hello, Harlan. The blonde man's voice penetrated past the glass. We are here for birthday. They all looked excited and motioned to the front door. They were all wearing tunics and leggings. Traditional birthday clothes or something. I was completely floored. I didn't know what to do. So I just sort of nodded and subtly slinked back into my kitchen. Dmitri came to pull at my arm. Come on, Papa, we have to let them in. I don't know any of them. Yes, you do, Papa. It's Uncle Boris. It's Uncle Boris. I yanked my hand away. It was one thing to pretend I was this kid's dad for a night. It was quite another to let a group of strangers into my house first thing in the morning. Dmitri frowned. I'll open the door. Wait, hold on. I grabbed Dmitri's shoulder. He turned away. Let go. I tried to pull him back, but then he dragged me into the living room again. Our struggle was on display for everyone outside. Boris looked at me with saucer eyes. Dmitri pulled harder, and I had no choice but to pull harder back. The boy hit his head on a table as he fell. Boris yelled something in Russian. Someone else hollered back. I heard hands trying to wrench open my door. Dmitri, stop, I said. Let's just take a minute to... You're hurting me, Papa. Oi! My front door unlocked. Footsteps barreled inside. I let go of my son and watched 3 large Slavic men enter my house with stern expressions. Dmitri hid behind them. Is everything okay? Boris peered down at me through his tangle of blonde hair. Yes, sorry, I said, struggling to find words. I'm just very... confused. Confused? Why were you hitting Dmitri? The little boy pulled on his uncle's arm and whispered something into his ear. Boris's expression furrowed. But before I could speak further, a slender pair of arms pushed aside all the male figures and revealed a woman with unwavering, bloodshot eyes. Something in me knew it was her. Svetlana. She wore a draped brown sheet as a dress, with skin so pale I could practically see her sinews and bones. It's like she had some extreme form of albinism. Harlan. she said, somehow breaking my name into 3 syllables. Har-L-N. I've never been so instinctively afraid of a person in my life. It's like she had weaved herself out of the darkest edges of memory. I saw flashes of her holding my waist in Moscow outside Red Square. Flashes of her lips whispering chants in the shadows of St. Basil's Cathedral. Svetlana held Dmitri's shoulder, then looked up at me. Just tell him it'll be normal. Tell him everything will be normal. No, this is not happening. None of this is real. Barefoot and still wearing the same clothes as yesterday, I bolted out the back of my house and hurtled towards my driveway. Before the rest of my new family could realize what was going on, I hopped into my Subaru and stepped on the gas. As I drove away from my house, I looked back into my rear-view mirror. And I swear it didn't look like my house at all. I swear it looked like a thatched roof hut. Back at the university, I walled myself up in my study. I canceled all speaking arrangements for the next week, saying I needed a few personal days. No one in my department knew I had a son. Nothing in my study indicated I had an extended Russian family. When I asked Pat about our phone conversation last night, her response was, "What conversation?" My mom said the same thing. With immense trepidation, I returned to my house the following day. And after setting foot back inside, I knew that everything had reverted back to the way it was before. No more framed pictures of Dmitri, no more alarming photo albums. In that clay-walled room where Dmitri spun tops and slept inside, it was just my home office again. To this day, I still have no clue what happened during that bizarre September weekend. But doing some of my own research, I'm starting to think I did encounter something in Moscow all those years ago. Some kind of lingering old curse, or a stray spirit, or a Chernaya Vedma, a black witch disguised as an ordinary woman. Although I haven't seen any evil things bubble up around my place since, every now and then I do have a conversation with Mrs. Babbage, and she seems to remember my son very well. Such a cute little guy, always waving hello. Did you know he offered me food once? I think it was Kraft dinner. It was Kraft. Story 3. My neighbor has been beckoning my children from his window at night. I, 33M, live in Texas with my daughter Alicia, 8F, and my son Jay, 4M. Their mom has been out of the picture for the past 2 years. Not dead, just a piece of shit. And I've managed pretty well as a single father. The 3 of us lived in a 2-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. I've got a solid job, and the kids are thankfully healthy. Everything was smooth sailing until one night 2 months ago, during which I was awoken by Jay poking me in the face. He was sobbing violently, though I recognized it as the "I'm afraid" kind of crying as opposed to the "I'm hurt" kind of crying, which made me a little less worried. Jay's always been nightmare prone, so I assumed that's what was causing him distress. When I asked him what was wrong, though, he said, "The man in the next house is making scary faces at me." I'd heard my fair share of Jay's stories about monsters terrorizing him from the dark corners of his bedroom. But this was something new. I assumed he meant our neighbor's house, and the lack of fantastical elements in his description made me uneasy. It felt too specific to be one of his usual nightmares. I got out of bed and walked with Jay in tow to my kids' room. Alicia was awake in the top bunk. From the soft glow of their nightlight, I could see her crossing her arms and scowling down at her little brother. I didn't turn on any lights to give myself a better view of the outdoors and peered out the bedroom window. Their window had curtains on it, but for once they hadn't been drawn all the way, and there was a small opening between them through which Jay must have looked out. One side of the neighbor's house, the one to our left from the street, was visible from Alicia and Jay's room. There were 2 windows on the neighbor's side of the house, but it was too dark inside to see anything. I recalled from what I'd seen in the daylight that the window on the left, the one closest to the front of the house, was the kitchen. I wasn't sure what the window on the right was, as it always had its curtains drawn. I asked Alicia if she'd seen anything, and she shook her head. He's always having nightmares and crying. I don't want to share a room with him anymore, Dad. I never get any sleep. It's not fair. Of course. Hearing that made Jay start crying again, so I let him sleep in my room for the night. He has this TMNT indoor camping tent that he prefers to his actual bed. Honestly, at that point, I half suspected his nightmare to be a ploy to get me to let him camp. Anyway, I guess I'm a total pushover because he slept in that tent in my room for the next 2 nights. On the 3rd night, I was again woken up, but this time by Alicia, who was standing over me and shaking my arm. That kid hadn't woken me up in the middle of the night for years. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, "The neighbor was making faces at me." Those words and the fear in my daughter's voice really put me on edge. I closed the curtains when I said goodnight. "Did you open them?" "Only a little. But it's because I heard a weird noise." "What did you hear?" Alicia couldn't recall exactly. According to her, she had gotten out of bed to see what was going on, and when she lifted the curtain, she saw a light on in the neighbor's window. The curtains in the back room had been drawn back, and our neighbor was standing in his house, right up against the window frame. What was he doing? Alicia thought for a moment and then made an expression I never want to see on my child's face, or anyone else's for that matter, ever again. I won't do it justice by describing it, but it looked something like this. First, she smiled with both sets of teeth, so that there was a little open sliver between the rows, and then she furrowed her eyebrows. She inclined her head towards me, kind of Kubrick stare-esque, and strained the muscles in her neck. The worst part, though, was what she did with her hands. She held out her left arm, forearm up. Then she clenched her right hand into a fist and moved it back and forth rapidly over her forearm. Poor thing described it as playing the violin, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that my neighbor was pantomiming cutting. Disturbed, I told Alicia to stop and to not make either the expression or the gesture again. I was angry and confused. My neighbor, a man in his 40s, was a bit of a recluse, but he had seemed normal enough in the 3 or 4 times I'd spoken to him. I couldn't fathom why he would do something like that to my kids. After asking Alicia a few more questions, I realized that my neighbor might not have done anything technically, or at least legally, wrong. It wasn't against the law to make inappropriate gestures in your own home, but it seemed like he was targeting my kids specifically. Legal or not, I planned to have a little chat with him the following morning. My last question to Alicia was if our neighbor had made any other gestures, and she nodded. Then she started making beckoning, "come here" motions with both of her hands. I had Alicia sleep in my room for the night as well. I also checked out the window in my kids' room, but like before, I saw nothing. The house was completely dark. The next morning before work, and after dropping Alicia and Jay off to school, I spent a good 5 minutes knocking on my neighbor's front door. I figured he was home since his car was in the driveway, but he never answered the door. Eventually I had to leave for work, and as I was walking away, I turned around quickly to see if he was watching me. He was the coward. I saw him for a split second at the front window before he ducked beneath the sill and out of view. Clearly, the guy had problems. I yelled out to him to stop fucking with us and then left. That same night, I put a plan in motion. While my kids slept in my room, I hung out in theirs. It was a Friday night, and I was ready to pull an all-nighter so that I could catch my neighbor in the act. Although I trusted my kids, I wanted to confirm that there was actually something nefarious going on before I escalated things. I made sure the house was locked up and all the curtains drawn, tucked my kids in, and sat on the floor under the window in their room. At around 9, I started marathoning midnight mass on my phone. I didn't want to wear headphones and miss any strange sounds, so I kept the volume low and mostly read subtitles. At midnight, I started to hear strange sounds. Like Alicia said, it's a bit hard to describe. Best I can do is that it was this low, repeated clicking sound. You know the chick-chick sound you make to beckon a horse? It was something like that. All I knew is that the sound was undoubtedly coming from a person. After a few minutes of this, the sound switched to what I think was supposed to be a whistle, but it came out all wrong, like someone sucking breath in through their teeth. The sound was so crisp that the neighbor's window must have been open, which was an unsettling thought, given that there was only around 15 feet of space between our houses. Certain that the neighbor was at his window, and that this was my best chance to see him, I stood up and pulled the curtain back in one motion. I saw him right away. There was a dim light on in his room, allowing me to see that horrible expression Alicia had made the night prior. It was one thing to see my child's recreation, but it was far more frightening on an adult. His window was indeed open, and his arms were stuck out into the cold night, violently swiping against each other in a grotesque mimicry of self-harm. When he saw me and realized that he was looking at another grown man and not some poor child, he stopped his erratic motions. His cartoonish grin faded, and another, more genuine emotion settled over his features. Rage. The man grabbed the window and slammed it shut, then closed the curtains with the same forcefulness. I let my own curtain fall. I was a little shell-shocked, I think. Of course, I was perturbed by the sight of the man, by his face and his movement, and the fact that he'd been doing that for who knows how many nights now in an attempt to frighten my kids. However, another detail stuck out as even more concerning to me, which was the fact that I genuinely wasn't sure if the man I'd just seen was my neighbor. I'd seen him so few times in the years I'd lived in that house, and I was having trouble conjuring up his face. I sat on the floor for a minute, my blood thundering in my ears. I definitely had enough evidence at that point to call the cops, right? Just as I was about to pull out my phone, I heard a tremendous smack against the glass of the bedroom window. After a brief hesitation, I pulled the curtain back again. There were no lights on in the neighbor's house, and there was also no one outside from what I could see. I pulled the curtains back a little further and saw a handprint in the top corner of the window pane. It's worth noting that our house is on a raised foundation, and that particular window is very tall. So even though the window is on the first floor, the man outside would have needed an insane vertical to get his hand up there. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to them, I quickly walked around the house to see if I could catch a glimpse of the man. My last stop was my bedroom. Once inside, I locked the doors, and while still on the phone with the operator, I took my handgun out of the safe in my closet. My heart was beating out of my damn chest, but I knew I had to stay calm. Even more so when I saw that Alicia was awake and looking out of the tent at me. I reassured her in as few words as I could, whispering that we were okay, but we had to stay very quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, my firearm ready and my ears straining. My kids' tent was in the corner, and to the left of the tent, in the middle of the wall and directly across from where I sat, was a window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something. It was a cloudless night, and the moonlight was bright enough that I could see a silhouette through the white curtains. The dark shape was nebulous at first, but became more clear as the man outside stepped closer to the window. Somehow he knew which room we were in. The silhouette didn't move for several minutes, and I remember being thankful that from the angle at which she sat, Alicia couldn't see it. Then something happened that I couldn't entirely wrap my head around. The man stepped back from the glass and raised his arms, making a Y shape with his body and his limbs. Only his arms were far too long. They seemed to be double the length that they should have been, each arm about the same length as his entire body. I thought at first that he was holding something, maybe two pipes, that just appeared to be an extension of his limbs, but I could clearly see two hands at the ends of the extremities. I could see 5 fingers on each hand, flopping around slightly as the man brought his arms closer to the window. Thud, thud, thud. I stood up and readied myself to shoot. But just then the sounds of sirens pierced the quiet night. The man outside banged his hands against the window one last time, and then it was as if someone had sliced his arms at the elbows. His forearms seemed to shear right off, and the man took off running before they so much as hit the ground. When the police officers announced themselves, I answered the door and explained the situation to them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, asked me a few questions about my neighbor, which I assume was necessary to establish probable cause for a search. Once finished, they told me to stay inside with the doors locked while they investigated the neighbor's house. I watched them through the window of Alicia and Jay's room. They knocked on the neighbor's door, and when no one answered, they tried the front door handle. I watched the unlocked door swing open. The 2 looked at one another and then entered. I'm not sure what they found inside that house. All I know is that when they emerged a few moments later, they both looked very disturbed. When I went outside to ask what they had found, the female officer told me simply, "Your neighbor's dead." The rest of the night was a blur of strangers in uniforms filing in and out of my neighbor's home. Some came to my porch afterwards to ask me questions, and none offered me any answers. They moved with tight-lipped efficiency, their faces guarded, their words clipped. At one point, I wandered to the side of the house and found several people photographing something on the ground outside my bedroom window. Before they could ask me to leave, I made out the gruesome shape of 2 human arms. The kids and I have been staying in my parents' apartment for months, and I think everyone, even Jay, is getting tired of the cramped living situation. We can't stay in the house. Alicia is way too traumatized for that, and I wouldn't be comfortable staying there while the murderer is still at large anyway. I want to sell the damn house, but our story going semi-viral is making that difficult. After all, who would want a house that, thanks to the news, has become permanently associated with phrases like dismemberment and days of torture, and victim barely recognizable as human? Story 4. My neighbor got a dog. I don't think it's actually a dog. My neighbor Jack adopted a border collie 2 weeks ago. At least, that's what I thought. Now I'm not so sure. I first saw Toto out on a walk. He was sniffing some of the flowers growing next to the sidewalk as Jack waited, scrolling through his cell phone. "Wow, you got a dog?" I called out, waving. "I certainly did. His name's Toto, border collie mix." Toto stopped sniffing the flowers and glanced up at me. I'd encountered many dogs on this street, and they ran the whole gamut of dog greetings, from curious sniffs to protective growling to jumping up and licking my face. None of them just stared at me like Toto did. "Wow, he's beautiful and so big for a collie mix." I began to crouch down. "Can I pet him?" "Oh, actually, he's a little shy," Jack said. "Having a little trouble adapting, but I'm sure he'll warm up in a few days." He tugged gently on the leash. "Come on, Toto." I watched as they walked away from me. The next time I saw Toto, I was dropping something off for Jack. He'd lent me his drill for a home improvement project, and I'd never returned it. But when I rang the doorbell, I didn't hear the usual barking I did with other dog owners. Instead, just the pat, pat, pat of feet against wood. And then Toto's face was in the glass inset of the door, staring out at me. Not barking or growling or pawing at the door, just staring. Before I could think anything of it, Jack's footsteps sounded through the hall and the door swung open. "Hey, Amir. Just wanted to give you this back." "Oh, thanks." "Hey, why don't you come in? I'm just about to pull some cookies out of the oven." Jack was an avid baker, and I couldn't say no to his cookies. I stepped inside and followed the warm cinnamon smell to the kitchen. Toto followed behind me. But I could tell something was off. I don't have a dog, but I have a lot of friends with dogs, and we can always tell the dog is coming our way when we hear that mistakable clicking sound of its nails against the floor. It was instinctual at this point. Hear that sound and scarf down the last bit of steak, or put the chocolate out of reach, or get ready to get licked on the face. This dog didn't make that sound. No clicking of nails against the wooden floor, just sort of a dull thump, thump, thump with each step. I glanced back at Toto, and I realized his movements were a little odd too. His steps were a little jerky, a little stiff, a little clumsy for a dog of his build. He wasn't limping or anything, just overall the movements didn't look quite right. "Hope you like snickerdoodles," Jack said, pulling the tray out of the oven. "Wow, they look amazing. My Nana's recipe," he said proudly. "Ate these every day after school. Fond memories." I picked up a cookie and took a bite. But I had an audience. Toto was staring at me. Well, that wasn't weird. Dogs love to stare at people food. I was just about to ask Jack if these cookies were safe for dogs, but his phone went off. "Oh, sorry, man. Gotta take this," he muttered as he disappeared down the hall and into the office. I sat down at the kitchen table. Toto didn't move, just stared at me from across the kitchen. Weirdly, he wasn't licking his lips or anything as he stared hungrily at the cookie in my hand. "You're a weird dog." "But I like you," I said. The dog continued to stare. "I'm sorry I can't give you any cookie. I don't know if they're safe." More staring. "You're gonna like it here. It's a good neighborhood." He canted his head. And as he did, I realized there was something off. Something about the way the light bounced off his fur. It was a little too shiny, a little too perfectly groomed for a rough and tumble collie dog. I squinted at him, studying him. And then I heard something, a quiet rushing sound, like a whisper. And I guess I must have been imagining it, but it almost sounded like... God, it almost sounded like someone whispering. "Help me." I stared at the dog. "Sorry about that," Jack said, wandering back in. "I just had to take that. It was a new client, and we're trying to keep him." "How do you like the cookies?" "They were amazing," I said, standing up. "But I've got to go. Mandy and the girls will be back from softball any time now, and I'm supposed to have dinner ready." "Oh, dinner duty, huh?" He motioned at the snickerdoodles. "Take some back with you. Say you made them from scratch." "Mandy knows I can't bake like that, but thanks." I stepped out the front door, waving back at Jack and Toto. Jack waved, grinning. The dog just stared at me as usual, but this time, his black, glassy eyes sent chills down my spine. I swear, there's something fucked up about that dog. The girls were asleep, and Mandy and I were enjoying some much-needed quality time. We sat on the couch with a bottle of wine, an episode of The Office in the background as we talked about our days. Mandy was surprisingly interested in the story. "So you've never heard him bark?" "No." "And he walks weird and just stares at you?" "Yep." She shook her head, laughing. "That does sound really weird. Even weirder than Aunt Polly's dog. Remember her? Is that the one that makes the weird screeching sound?" "Yeah." We laughed about it, hung out some more, and then eventually went to sleep. But even an hour after Mandy had fallen asleep, around midnight, I was lying wide awake, thinking about that fucking dog. And then I decided to do something really stupid. I probably never would have done it if I hadn't drunk 3 glasses of wine. But with liquid courage, I crept downstairs and slipped out of the house. The lights were still on in Jack's house. When I got there, I ducked behind his hydrangea and peered into the window. Golden light spilled into the living room from the kitchen. Jack was sitting on the couch, looking at his laptop. Toto was lying on the floor, his black eyes glittering in the low light. Surprisingly, he didn't seem to detect my presence at all. After several minutes, Jack shut the laptop and disappeared down the hallway. Toto watched him, but didn't follow. I was about to go back home, and then I saw it. Toto stood up. And then, using the couch to balance himself, he stood up again. He was standing on 2 legs. I watched with wide eyes as he walked into the kitchen, stood in front of the refrigerator, and then a small opening appeared, smack dab in the middle of Toto's chest. A human hand came out. It grasped the refrigerator door, pulled it open, greedily grabbed some food off the shelf. Then the dog sat back down on the floor, cross-legged, and the hand, holding a leftover sandwich, disappeared into the hole. I stared through the window, my heart pounding in my chest. It's a costume. There's a person in there. I hightailed it out of there, wrapped myself in blankets, and lay next to my wife, wide awake, thoughts rolling through my head. I didn't expect to fall asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, a loud noise woke me from a deep sleep. Knocking. Someone was knocking on my front door. Bleary-eyed, I hobbled down the stairs. I looked through the peephole and saw Jack, standing on my front porch, looking incredibly angry. I don't know what he wants, but I think he knows that I know. That for some reason he's keeping what appears to be a full-grown man in his house, wearing a dog costume and pretending to be a dog. Because when I went over there that night, still tipsy from the wine, I totally forgot he has security cameras. Story 5. The Quiet Neighbor. Just about the first thing anyone new to the neighborhood learned was to avoid Bud Fillmore. Cantankerous, territorial, and fueled by what seemed to be a deep-seated hatred for just about everything. He was the kind of man that childhood nightmares were made of. Although he'd only lived there for a few months longer than us, by the time my family moved in across the street from the Fillmore house, his reputation was already firmly established. When other neighbors came by with their cookies and casseroles to welcome us, and saw me and my brother, just 9 and 11, they'd pull my parents aside and offer hushed warnings. "Keep them away from that nasty little man across the way," Mrs. Devon said. "He can't stand children." "My son Bill swears Bud tried to run him down in his car," Mr. Crane said. "He'll look for any excuse to yell at them. He says the most terrible things," Mrs. Paul said. My parents thanked them, but I don't think they quite believed them. My mom especially wasn't fond of gossip, and she tried to take such rumors with a grain of salt until she could make her own decisions. She didn't have to wait long. My older brother Scotty and I were outside, tossing a baseball back and forth one Saturday morning when Scotty tossed it too hard and high. It sailed over my head, bounced in the street, and rolled to a stop at the very edge of Mr. Fillmore's yard. Both of us had overheard our neighbor's warnings and were hesitant to even look at the house, much less approach it. "Go get it, Liz," Scotty said, nudging my shoulder. "But you threw it," I replied. "So? You missed it." I couldn't reach it. My whining had no effect. He pushed me towards the road, and after checking both ways, I began to creep across towards our ball. I had almost reached it. I just had to take a couple more steps, and it would have been within my grasp when the front door of the house flew open. "What the hell are you doing?" A stout man with thin, graying hair came bursting outside and stomped across his lawn towards me. My ball," I tried to say, pointing to it. "You brats throwing things at my house? Think it would be funny to break a window?" No. I glanced over my shoulder to see Scotty half poised to run inside and whimpered. "Get out of here," Mr. Fillmore snapped. "Can I just—" "No." Before I could react, he'd scooped up the baseball, which had barely been touching his grass, and stormed back inside. The whole front of his house seemed to shake with the force of his slammed door. It was the first of what would be many run-ins with everyone's least favorite neighbor. Our parents tried to talk to him about his behavior, but he just told them to keep their noisy little shits off his lawn and away from his house if we didn't want trouble. Dad thought about calling the cops on him, but his mom became fond of saying there was no law against being rude, so we were told to just try and be more careful. "He must not have always been such a bull," Mom said over dinner about a month after we'd moved in. "He's married, you know." Dad scoffed at the idea. Oh yeah? How do you know? Dolores Devon was by again for a chat and it came up. Bud wears a ring and she said she sees Mrs. Phillimore looking out the windows from time to time, but the poor woman never comes outside. She thinks she heard Bud say it was cancer once. Poor lady, sick and married to that, Dad said. Terrible, isn't it? But it does explain a bit about him. He's just trying to keep things quiet and peaceful around his house. Yeah, sure, Scotty muttered and Mom frowned at him. He's probably very sad, and lashes out without meaning to. He's an asshole, Scotty said. Language, Dad warned. But yeah, he is. Whatever his reasoning, we all agreed it would be best to just try and avoid Bud Phillimore. Scotty and I were extra careful to keep all of our toys well within the confines of our own yard when we played outside. I also couldn't help but keep a wary eye on the house across the street, just in case he decided to be extra crazy and we had to run for it. That's when I started to notice Mrs. Phillimore. Almost every time Scotty and I were out and I happened to glance at their house, I would see a tall, slender figure outlined behind the sheer curtains in one of the upstairs windows. While I couldn't get a very good look at her, I figured it couldn't be anyone but the missus. Mr. Phillimore didn't have anyone else. She never banged on the window or shouted at us like her husband. She'd just stand there watching us. I like to imagine that she was a nice lady, a quiet neighbor who just enjoyed seeing kids at play. I remembered my mom saying, Mrs. Phillimore was sick and I felt sorry that she was trapped in her house with her horrible husband, so I tried to be nice and smile and wave once. Just once. Mr. Phillimore appeared on his front stoop and yelled at me for being a pest until I retreated inside. When I peeked out the living room window later, Mrs. Phillimore wasn't in her usual spot anymore. Eventually we got used to Mr. Phillimore glowering at us as he drove slowly past, his short temper and his loud voice. It was such a regular thing that our fear turned to caution, turned eye-rolling dismissiveness. Bud doesn't own the street. You kids go out and be kids, and if he has a problem with it, I'll deal with him, Dad said. After that, we started to be a little less careful with our things, and a little more free with our laughter. We lost a few balls to the Phillimore yard, 1 or 2 frisbees, but nothing we really cared too much about. Nothing until Scotty's remote-controlled helicopter. It had been a birthday present, and we were both eager to try it out. As soon as we finished supper, we raced out to the front lawn where Scotty prepared for the helicopter's first flight. Under my brother's inexperienced and clumsy guidance, the helicopter lifted slowly from the ground and staggered drunkenly through the air. In his excitement to keep it aloft, Scotty didn't even realize it was heading right for Phillimore's yard until it was too late. Scotty! I tugged at his arm to try and turn it off course, but it only made things worse. The little helicopter took a nosedive straight into the hedges under Mr. Phillimore's bay window. Scotty frantically wiggled the controls, but the helicopter's blade was stuck fast in the thick greenery. As if he'd been waiting for us to slip up, the front door was flung open and he practically pounced on the toy. What have I told you? He bellowed. Before we could argue, he had already disappeared back into his house. Upstairs, the curtain fluttered just so, and I knew Mrs. Phillimore was watching. I wanted to call up to her and ask her to get the helicopter back, but Scotty grabbed my wrist and dragged me behind him to find Mom and Dad. When our parents went over later, he refused to come to the door. Don't worry, kids, they assured us. Next time we see him, we'll sit down and have a real discussion about this. That wasn't enough for Scotty, though. I followed him up to his room and sat on the end of his bed while he paced back and forth while ranting about how unfair it all was. He was fuming and furious, and he wanted his birthday present back now. But how? I asked. He paused, his gaze sliding to his window and the house beyond. We're going to take it. It was a childish, simple, stupid plan with no thought to consequence or punishment. We were going to break into the Phillimore house and get all of our things back. We'll do it when he goes out next, I can figure out how to get the lock open. It can't be that hard. Then we just have to find our stuff. What about Mrs. Phillimore? She never leaves. You can distract her or something. I don't know. We'll figure it out. I don't know, Scotty, I said uneasily. I didn't want to disrupt a poor sick lady for a few toys. Don't worry, we'll just be in and out. She probably won't even notice we're there. I doubted that. But I had a hard time saying no to my big brother. Scotty put his plan into action the very next afternoon. We were playing a game of horse in the driveway when Mr. Phillimore's garage opened and his car chugged to life. He was wearing his customary scowl as he drove by. The moment he turned the corner, Scotty chucked our basketball off to the side and bolted across the street. I checked to see if Mrs. Phillimore was in her window, and when I saw no sign of her, I followed. Scotty's idea of getting the lock open turned out to be using a small rock to break the window pane on the door above the latch. It was something he'd seen in a movie or something. Immediately I had images of flashing red and blue lights and handcuffs, and my stomach turned sharply. But my brother whispered that it would be fine. He can't prove it was us. Everyone on the street hates him. He sounded so confident that all I could do was nod. Scotty reached carefully through the broken glass, careful not to cut himself, and found the deadbolt. It clicked out of place, and he pushed the door open, letting us into Mr. Fillmore's house. I clung to the back of Scotty's shirt as we tiptoed across the kitchen. It was spotless, obsessively so, and smelled of cleaning supplies. Every window had something tacked over it, old blankets and towels, blocking out the bright afternoon sun and casting the room into a gloomy darkness that made the room seem small and oppressive. I swallowed hard and forced myself to follow Scotty. Every room was the same, fastidiously clean, organized, and shrouded in shadows. The bay window that I knew he spied on us from had a little hole cut into the heavy velveteen material, just big enough for someone to see out of. I could just picture him sitting on his plastic-covered couch, watching us, waiting for us to get too close. It was enough to make me shudder. We cleared the hole downstairs pretty quickly, but there was no sign of our things. Shit, Scotty hissed. He must keep it upstairs. But Mrs. Phillimore, just stay close and stay quiet, okay? I nodded, too nervous to say anything else anyway. We'd only gotten up a few steps when the floorboards on the second floor creaked. Scotty immediately pressed himself against the wall and motioned for me to do the same. We listened to the soft padding of footsteps crossing from one room to another. Scotty, I whispered, grabbing at his sleeve with both hands. Let's just go. No, he went too far this time. I'm going to get my helicopter. Door hinges squeaked from somewhere upstairs and the footsteps stopped. Scotty pulled his arm from me and scampered up the remaining steps. Reluctantly, I went up too. We found a guest bedroom first. It was all muted colors and magazine-quality furniture, void of any warmth or personality. Like it was just set up for show, never intended for use. At least it was a bit brighter up there. The windows only had a few layers of sheer curtains over them. Enough to obscure visibility, but still let in light. The second room was obviously Mr. Phillimore's. It was the most lived-in looking room of them all, and even then that was only because there were some pictures hanging on the walls and some personal items on the nightstand. The bed was meticulously made, all the clothing, most of which was masculine, hung neatly in the closet. There wasn't even any stray hairs in the brush on the vanity. I wondered how someone could live in such a cold, lifeless house. There was only one room left upstairs, the one Mrs. Philemon must have gone into. Its door stood half open. Scotty and I traded a look, his determined, mine silently pleading with him to go. He took a step towards the door. I shook my head and grabbed at the back of his shirt again. He brushed me off and placed the flat of his hand on the door, pushing it open slowly. Inside the room was almost empty except for a large vanity against one wall. A framed wedding picture was on it, and I recognized Mr. Phillimore despite being younger and thinner. In front of the vanity, posed on a tall stool, was a mannequin. She was wearing what I thought of as a 50s housewife dress, white with little pink and green flowers all over it, a string of pearls, and a blonde wig carefully combed back into a bun. Her featureless face was fixed on the mirror in front of her. Scotty's brow wrinkled, showing the same confusion as I'd felt. We'd both heard Mrs. Phillimore walk to this room, but there was no one there. "Let's just go," I begged, a cold sweat starting to trickle down the back of my neck. Scotty shifted his weight, obviously torn, and the floorboard beneath his feet groaned. The mannequin's head turned sharply towards us. Scotty leapt back with a yelp, an arm thrown out protectively in front of me. "Liz," his voice was trembling, "run!" I stumbled back down the hall on legs that didn't want to work. I could heard Scotty stomping along behind me, and behind him, a rapid skittering. We skid at the top of the stairs, and I grabbed the railing to keep from falling headlong down the steps. While I righted myself, I dared to glance back down the hallway. It was empty. Where'd it go? Something thudded against the ceiling. We both looked up and screamed. The mannequin was crawling, spider-like, over our heads. She wrenched her head completely around, turning her blank face towards us, and flitted towards the wall. She started to descend, the whole time facing us. I was still screaming when Scotty hooked his arm around my waist and hauled me down the steps. We crashed at the landing, tripping over one another, and we could hear the click of fiberglass on wood as she pursued us. I was crying, scrambling on my hands and knees across the floor, and my brother was shouting for me to get up, to go. He grabbed the back of my shirt and practically threw me down the hall, and then Scotty was shrieking. I spun. The mannequin was crouched on the last step, one arm outstretched. She had her fingers wrapped around Scotty's ankle. They were tightening, until his bones started to crunch beneath her grip. He kicked at her with his other leg, but it did nothing. She started to drag him back toward the stairs. "Scotty!" I screamed, but before I could move, he looked up at me and shook his head furiously. "Liz!" He could barely get the word out through the fear and pain that masked his face. "Run!" I wanted to stay. I wanted to grab his hand and pull with all my might and drag him out of that house with me. But he shouted again, "Run! Run!" over and over until the words became a garbled mess of howling, terrified cries that chased me out the same door we'd come in through. It was the last time I ever saw my big brother. No trace of Scotty was ever found. My parents searched, police searched. There were dogs and special agents, and tons of time, money, and energy were put into trying to find him. But none of it mattered. It was as if he had simply vanished. Bud Phillimore wasn't a suspect very long. With no evidence and no history of any kind of criminal record, he was let go. Scotty was dubbed a missing child, reduced to a single box of paperwork that was all too soon moved to the cold case stacks. No one believed me when I told them what really happened. They all said Scotty must have been kidnapped on our way back from Mr. Phillimore's house, and I was too young to really understand it. That I had gotten confused and, in my fear, made up some story using the scary thing I'd just encountered. Mr. Phillimore's mannequin belonged to his late wife, Sharon. He kept it after she passed because it reminded him of her. Sometimes he'd move it around, put it in a window, but it wasn't alive. You understand that, right, Liz? My therapist was fond of asking. I told her what she wanted to hear, even if I knew it was a lie. The adults preferred it that way. It was easier for all of us. Maybe that was why I never showed anyone the note that had been left taped to our door, typed and anonymous, that just said, "I tried to keep you away." I didn't think it would have changed anything. I knew, though, and I never doubted myself, or the fact that Scotty had sacrificed himself for me, and up until Mr. Phillimore packed up and moved a few years later, I would sit in my brother's room and I would stare out the window at his house. I would watch the second-story window, waiting for the telltale dark figure to appear behind the curtains, waiting for the quiet neighbor that everyone said didn't exist. Story 6. My neighbors are acting suspicious, and their children aren't aging. I was 4 years old when the Ambrosio family moved in next door. There was the mother, Valentina, the father, Paul, their 8-year-old daughter Ria, and their 5-year-old son Billy. Valentina was tall, slender, golden blonde, and sociable, all sweetness and light and small talk. Paul was dark-haired, burly, taciturn, always tailing his wife like a shadow. Billy was scrawny, clumsy, often sick, and prone to saying the weirdest things. But it was Ria that caught my attention. Even skinnier and sicklier than her brother, she'd inherited her father's quiet nature, always vanishing into the background so she could read. And that was on the days when she was healthy enough to be out of bed. Like her mother, she was golden blonde and blue-eyed. Unlike her mother, Ria's left eye had a distinctive flaw, a single metallic gold spot just below the pupil. As far as I can remember, my parents liked the Ambrosios, and I had something of a crush on Ria. But looking back, we didn't know much about them at all. They moved away just before I turned 5. I didn't think there was anything strange about it. It was a tumultuous time in our neighborhood, with people renting houses and moving out just as quickly once the rent got too high. When I was 10, my parents decided to move as well. Unfortunately, just as I was getting excited about the idea, bureaucracy hit us hard. It seemed like every time we were ready to start packing, there was another form to fill in, and so my parents were left trapped indoors with their paperwork while I roamed the neighborhood, all of us bored out of our skulls. And then, a week after we should have left, the Ambrosios moved back in next door. Ria and Billy were the first to arrive that day, clambering out of their car and marching up the driveway as if they'd never left. And immediately, I knew something was wrong. Neither of them had aged. Ria was still 8, Billy was still 5. It had been years since I'd last seen them, but even I could remember that they'd been bigger than me at the time. Now I'd somehow outgrown them. And no sooner had I recovered from the shock, Valentina stepped out of the driver's seat, every bit as vital as she'd been 5 years ago, without lines on her face or the slightest trace of gray in her hair. Then she saw me peering over the fence. Instantly, her smiling face dropped into a stunned gape. Then her mouth twisted into a scowl, and she looked at me with such venom in her pale blue eyes that I instinctively ducked out of sight, suddenly convinced beyond all rationality that she'd hurt me. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek out again, she'd gone indoors, taking Paul and Billy with her. Ria was still standing there, eyes wide with an emotion I'd never seen from her. Hope. Then Valentina stormed out onto the driveway, grabbed Ria by the arm and dragged her indoors, hissing furiously at her as they vanished into the depths of the house. A moment later, I heard the faint but unmistakable sound of Ria screaming in pain. I didn't tell my parents about what I'd seen. I wanted to, but something about that look of bilious hatred in Valentina's eyes filled me with such dread that I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. By the time I went indoors, I'd given myself a million different excuses to avoid telling them about it, even briefly convincing myself that the 2 kids weren't Ria and Billy at all, but their cousins. Any excuse would do if it meant I wouldn't have to face Valentina again. But I couldn't forget or ignore the way she'd grabbed Ria, or the scream I'd heard after she'd been hauled indoors. So, despite my fear, I kept an eye on the Ambrosio house, trying to find a moment when I could talk to one of the kids without their parents noticing, or Valentina appearing at the door to offer me a cup of cocoa. One day, Valentina took Paul and Billy on a shopping trip, so I took the opportunity to sneak over, hoping to speak to the only member of the family left behind. In the end, I didn't get anywhere until I crept around the side of the house and found Ria waiting for me at the back door. Immediately I saw the gold flaw on her left eye, and any remaining doubts melted away. This was the real Ria Ambrosio in the flesh, somehow still 8 years old. More unusually, her eyes were unfocused, the pupils wildly dilated. Her hands were trembling as she opened the door for me, and her forehead was glistening with sweat. At the time, I thought she was just sick, but now I know she'd been sedated to keep her under control. It must have been taking every atom of her strength just to stay on her feet. And as she let me in, I saw that her right hand had been heavily bandaged, completely obscuring her fingers. No sooner was I indoors, she lost her balance, falling hard on her left leg and leaving a huge bloody scrape across her knee. But just as I was helping her up and looking around for a band-aid, I saw the entire wound seal shut, leaving behind nothing but bare skin and a faint bloodstain on her shorts. Once I'd recovered from the shock, I naturally wanted to ask questions. But before I could even start, Rhea put a hand over my mouth and hissed, "Shh." She then drew a notepad and pencil from her pocket, and on the top page, clumsily scrawled out, "Can't tell you the house is bugged. She's listening." She paused, hope dawning in her unfocused eyes, and then wrote, "Easier to show you." I let her lead me into the study, where a large box of photo albums sat, ready to be unpacked and locked in a filing cabinet. Selecting the topmost album, Rhea opened it for me. Inside was a series of antique photographs, many of them dating back to the late 19th century. And they didn't feature grandparents or great-grandparents, but Valentina Ambrosio herself, just as glamorous as she was in the present. About the only thing different about her were the black robes embroidered with occult symbols that she wore in the oldest photographs. No matter how far back the album went, Valentina never aged. She remained outwardly 30, as vital as ever. The same couldn't be said for everyone else. Before long, the most common of the photos was of Valentina at funerals, mourning the death of another loved one and looking a little more dispirited with every shot. But then her spirits reignited with a series of romantic photographs, climaxing with her wedding to Paul in 1935. Cast the enchantment on him the morning after. Valentina's handwritten caption read, "Now we'll be together forever." And then there was Rhea's first baby photo, dated 1937. Paul had even gone to the expense of using color film just to capture that distinctive gold flaw in her eye. At this, I looked up at Rhea with a questioning look. I wasn't great at math in those days, but even I knew that she should be around 60 at the very least. Rhea understood at once and nodded. And to this day, I can still remember just how tired she seemed in that moment. Billy was born in 1940. Judging by the next few photographs, he and Rhea had enjoyed a very happy childhood. Trips to the beach, lavish family Christmas parties, tree houses too elaborate to be built by normal parents, Halloween parties with impossibly realistic disguises, and even a few shots of Rhea studying a huge leather-bound book, captioned "My Little Sorceress." But photo by photo, Valentina's mood began to change again. As Rhea turned 9 and Billy turned 6, their mother's expression soured with discontent, and every smile she wore from then on seemed a little more disappointed as the two grew older. Until at last, there was a photo of a teenage Rhea leaving for college, while next to her, a teary-eyed Valentina barely grimaced. The next few pages of the album were snapshots of Rhea and Billy's adult successes, sent back home to Valentina, torn up in a rage, then hastily taped back together again. This came to an end in 1962 with a beautifully handwritten letter, sealed and preserved in plastic. "Dear Rhea," it read, "I've considered your request, and I now realize that I was wrong to speak so harshly to you. You have every right to pursue your own dreams, and I will be more than happy to teach you the secret magics, even if doing so means that you will leave the country to pursue your research. Please come home to us, enjoy one last family dinner, and I will give you everything you need. Your loving mother." The album ended with 2 photos, likely taken by Paul. The first was a shot of an adult Rhea, tall, graceful, confident, and dressed to impress. Valentina stood behind her, her hand faintly glowing, her face twisted into a hideous smirk. The second was a shot of Rhea, suddenly 8 years old again, her now gigantic adult clothes draped over her like a tent, her mouth open in a scream of horror. And in the background, Valentina laughed triumphantly. "This family won't be broken," blared the caption. "We'll be together forever now." Billy wasn't given the same formality. He was kidnapped on the way back to his college dorm, according to Rhea's notes, then tied to a chair before being enchanted and regressed. And this time around, the entire transformation was captured in no less than 30 snapshots. The next few albums were a chronicle of Valentina forcing her 2 immortal children to live out their second childhoods as she wanted them to. Again, there were Christmas parties, tree houses, books, and trips to the beach. But the joy was gone, as were the friends who'd once been invited. Worst of all were the photos of Billy looking progressively more spaced out, accompanied by the caption of "finally found the right drug." Now he acts his age. Pity there's no drug that can induce docility and preserve that bookish streak, or Rhea would be perfect. But it wasn't until Rhea decided to show me the nursery where she and Billy slept that I finally realized just how nightmarish things had gotten for them, because that was where most of the punishments for being too grown up were enacted. After all, the only reason why Rhea had been able to escape this room and let me into the house was because Paul had drugged her instead of restraining her, not realizing that he'd gotten the dosage wrong. Outwardly, the Ambrosio nursery was just as bright and cheery as you'd expect for the children's room. But the door was clustered with locks and chains. There were handcuffs fastened to the bed frames, plastic sheeting on the mattresses. The top of the tall boy was clustered with pill bottles, glass vials, and syringes, and hanging from the ceiling was a curious-looking nursery mobile. Where most mobiles would have had farm animals, fish, birds, or stars, dangling from the strings of this baby mobile were 5 curiously fleshy shapes on fish hooks. I didn't realize what they were until I saw the fingernails. Heart hammering, I looked down at the bandages around Rhea's hand. By way of a reply, she held up a note that made my blood run cold. Fingers take longer to grow back. Rhea wanted freedom. She explained as much in her notes and begged me for help. She told me she just needed me to sneak into the house after everyone was asleep and copy a few pages of her mother's grimoire, just enough to control her own age and force Valentina into a compromise. Once Rhea and Billy were chained down and sedated for the night, Valentina was in the habit of leaving the grimoire out of its safe in the study, especially if she'd had a few glasses of wine during her nightly research. If Rhea left the bathroom window unlocked for me, it'd be easy for me to sneak in, or so she said. In the end, I agreed to help, mostly out of pity, but also because Rhea told me my life was in danger. After all, Valentina regularly faked IDs and moved her family so nobody would notice their immortality. My parents had screwed that up by delaying their departure from the old neighborhood, leaving me as a witness, and Valentina had left quite a few inconvenient witnesses in shallow graves over the years. In hindsight, I'm glad I never accepted any of the drinks she'd offered me earlier. So that night, once my parents had drifted off to sleep, I slipped out of bed, armed myself with a disposable camera, snuck out through the back door, and crept over to the Ambrosio house. The bathroom window had been left unlocked, as promised, and after years of climbing trees and shimmying up walls in my spare time, it didn't take too much effort to scramble over the sill and into the house. I still remember the deathly silence in the halls as I tiptoed to the study, of how the shadows seemed to bend and ooze around me, of how I froze at every pause, in the muffled snoring from the master bedroom, of how I tried with all my might not to think of exactly how Valentina would kill me if I got caught. Somehow, I made it to the study without being noticed, and sure enough, Valentina's grimoire was there on the desk, exactly as she'd left it. As soon as I was sure that nobody was awake to hear and the door was shut behind me, I turned on the desk light, leafed through the book until I found the pages that Ria was looking for, and photographed each one with the disposable camera. Once I'd finished photographing everything Ria had asked for, I flicked off the light and crept out of the house. And right on time, too. Paul had just gotten up for a glass of milk, and if I'd left a moment earlier, he'd have seen me leaving the study. And because I was there just in time to catch a glimpse of him heading to the kitchen, I could see he was ready in case Ria or Billy ever escaped from the nursery. He was armed with a cattle prod. The next day I got the photos developed. It cost me most of my pocket money, but I was just glad nobody at the shop asked questions about the content. Then, while Ria and Billy were playing outside and Valentina was distracted indoors, I slid the photos through a hole in the fence for Ria to pocket. It was a momentous occasion because it was the first time in 5 years I'd seen her smile. She even broke her silence long enough to whisper, "I won't forget this, Tom. I owe you more than you can possibly imagine." I don't know how she managed to hide the photographs long enough to learn from them, but I was expecting the results to be impressive. I was thinking that the confrontation between Valentina and Ria would be a magical duel right out of Hollywood, to the point that I spent the next few days waiting for a glimpse of the fireworks. But in hindsight, I now know that Ria wasn't going to confront her mother about anything. After all, the last time she'd given Valentina the benefit of a doubt, she'd de-aged Ria back to childhood while her back was turned. Why risk giving her a chance to strike first? So, I awoke one morning to find the house next door eerily silent. After spending nearly an hour watching for any sign of activity, I crept over for a closer look. The front door had been left hanging open, the filing cabinets and the safe had been emptied, Valentina's wardrobe had been raided, and the car was gone from the driveway. Of the Ambrosios, there was no sign. After that, my family and I moved out of the neighborhood and settled in Vermont, and my life returned to normal. Years went by. I did well in high school, went to college, got a job, began winning promotions, and eventually I got a small house of my own at a dirt cheap price. No family, though. My encounter with the Ambrosios permanently soured any notions of marrying and having children. And then last month I got new neighbors. I saw them that Saturday morning trundling to a stop in the driveway of the house next door and piling out of their van. A family with no less than 12 impressively diverse children, ranging from age 14 to 3 months old. Also, for some reason, 5 of them were dressed as pirates, complete with eye patches. The mother and sole parent looked uncannily familiar. Tall, dark-haired, confident, perhaps 30 years old and heavily pregnant. Just looking at her reminded me of photos from the 1960s for reasons I couldn't quite explain. But it wasn't until she walked up to say hello that I saw the distinctive gold blemish on her left eye, and finally realized why she seemed so familiar. Ria winked at me. "I told you I owed you more than you could possibly imagine," she whispered. Then she walked off to shepherd her children indoors, pausing only to beckon me to follow. And so I did, watching in awestruck silence as my old childhood crush went about settling her family into their new house with the kind of speed that only magic can manage. She'd learned a lot in the years since I'd last seen her, I realized, as the house's internal dimensions warped and expanded around us. But shocked as I was, it didn't take me too long to get suspicious about Ria's children. After all, the way they jumped to attention whenever they spoke and flinched whenever she raised her voice was concerning enough, as was the curiously mesmerized look to their adoring gazes whenever they huddled around her. And when I saw that the eldest child was a dead ringer for Billy Ambrosio at 14, I knew there could be only one explanation. "You said you just wanted to be free," I sighed. "I did," she admitted. "But in the meantime, I had to keep Mom and Dad under control, help Billy recover, and try to make a life for myself. It was easier to keep them young and weak. And after a few years of failing to make it in the legitimate world, I realized that I'd missed out on too many opportunities, too much history I could have thrived in. Rhea offered a sad little smile. In the end, I realized that after everything I'd been through at Mother's hands, what I wanted more than anything else in the world was power. To take back what I'd lost with interest. Magic gave me power, true, but being a parent gave me so much more than that. There's no drug in the world as pure and rapturous as the fear and love of a child for their mother. She giggled, actually giggled. Now I know why so many cult leaders have their followers call them father. I swallowed hard. But where did all these children come from? I asked, nervously. Who were they? Oh, drunks, addicts, petty criminals. Nobody who will be missed. Well, maybe one or two cops who came to investigate the disappearances and one nosy little imp from Child Protective Services, but it doesn't matter. I'm a better sorceress than Mother ever was. And for someone of my talents, laws and violence are of no concern. Besides, she added, it's not as if anyone can kill me, is it? And you're just going to keep adding to the family? You're just going to keep making random people immortal and de-aging them into children just for the sake of feeling powerful and loved? Why not? With my powers, I can feed, house, clothe, and entertain hundreds of them without paying a cent, maybe even thousands. And if I don't, well, they can't die either, so... That impish giggle again. Rhea paused and glanced at one of the younger children. Paul, she called, pushing a cooler towards him. Could you put this up in the nursery? The kid who had once been Rhea's father took the cooler with some difficulty. Like quite a few of the kids, he was dressed as a pirate, and something behind his eye patch seemed to be hurting him. He kept scratching and worrying at it. It wasn't until he shuffled into the nursery and opened the cooler that I realized why. Inside was a baby mobile, but thankfully, this one didn't have fingers hanging from it. Unfortunately, it was looking back at me. 5 newly extracted eyeballs hung from the mobile by the optic nerves, taken from 5 kids now dressed up as pirates. I was at my limit by then, and ready to make a run for it. But there was one other mystery that needed clearing up. Where's Valentina? I asked, almost dreading the answer. That's the beauty of magic, Rhea mused airily. Once the subject's immortal, I can control their age in any way I please. Where is she? Rhea didn't answer. She just smirked and gently stroked her swollen belly, delighting in the faint kicks from within. And that was my cue to leave. I'd heard enough, and frankly, I didn't want to hear Rhea's explanation. I didn't even want to imagine it, if only because my first visit to the Ambrosio house had left me with more than enough nightmares already. Paul reached out for me as I left, clutching pathetically at my jacket. Once upon a time, he'd been a hulking giant of a man, the terror of Rhea, Billy, and even me. Now he was 6 years old and tiny for his age. Kill me, he whimpered. Kill me. I muttered a half-hearted apology and pulled away, running for the door without looking back. I wouldn't have known how to help him, even if I'd wanted to. I wish my confession could have ended there. But 2 days ago I was gardening, trying to distract myself from my new neighbors, when I fumbled the pruning shears and accidentally sliced my left arm open. And before my eyes, the wound healed in a matter of seconds. I don't know when Rhea cast the spell of immortality on me, but that's the only thing that could explain it. She said she owed me for freeing her. Did she repay her debt by making me immortal and leaving me to my freedom? Or is her idea of a reward a place in her family, preserved in eternal childhood, and any minute I'll shrink back down to 10 years old? I don't know, and I'm not sticking around to find out. I don't need to worry about outliving relatives, forging IDs, what I'll have to do to stay sane, or even if Rhea will follow me. I just need to get the hell out of here before the worst transpires. All I leave behind is this confession of the role I played in unleashing a monster on the world, and a warning to avoid her at all costs if you see her. Hopefully, the description will be enough to save you. If not, well, There's always room for another child in the family. Story 7. My neighbors won't stop having kids. James slid his fingers down my waist and tucked them into my back pocket, bending over to kiss me on the cheek. We stood like that, in our freshly manicured front lawn, watching the movers carry our furniture up the front steps and into our new home. In our old apartment on the outskirts of the city, that furniture had felt large and compact, like a can of sardines. It was difficult to even maneuver to the fridge and back. Here in the suburbs, where every house was a cream-colored cookie-cutter copy of each other, it would feel like dollhouse decor. I took James by the wrist, removing his hand from my backside and giving him a coy smile. Our honeymoon phase hadn't really ever ended, not since we started dating, and definitely not since our wedding. I didn't think it ever would. Is this too much? I asked, resting my head on his shoulder. It'll feel so empty with just the two of us. For now, he muttered, and I could feel him smiling. We had never even really discussed starting a family just because it felt so implied. We could always just read each other's minds like that. I knew he wanted kids as soon as possible, but I also knew he knew I wanted to wait a little longer, and he respected that. It was inevitable, but not a priority. I looked around. I always found neighborhoods like this one a little creepy. They felt simulated and devoid of actual life. But not this one. Somehow, even though the houses were the same, they each felt different. The home to our left appeared empty, with a colorful for sale sign on the lawn, but the one to our right was lively. The windows were adorned with bright pink flowers overflowing from their pots, and the yard was sprinkled with children's toys. Even now there were kids outside. A young boy who appeared around 12 years of age, pushing a younger girl on a yellow swing set. Their laughter filled the air. "Hello?" a cheerful voice called, and I turned to see a woman marching towards us with a gleaming smile on her face. She was beautiful and young, maybe around my age, with blonde hair tied up in a pristine ponytail. Her pants fit her perfectly, accentuating her feminine curves, and her blouse was bunched up around her pregnant stomach. I felt myself subconsciously cross my arms, insecure. "Hello," my husband replied, bringing me out of my daze. I realized the woman was holding a dish wrapped in tinfoil and steaming. "You're the new neighbors, I presume?" she asked, her smile only brightening, revealing her perfectly white teeth. "Yes," I said, not wanting her to think I was rude. "I'm Adeline, this is James. We're so excited, this is such a lovely neighborhood." "As are we." My husband and I were so pleased to hear a young couple was moving in. "It really is the perfect place to raise a family," she said, knowingly, glancing at her children and then back at us. "Oh, we don't have kids," I said, a nervous laugh bubbling up in my throat. "Oh," she exclaimed. Her smile seemed to falter, but almost as if it were a glitch. It was so brief. She held out the dish in her hands. "Tuna casserole." James took it from her, peeling back some of the foil and taking a whiff. "Smells delicious." "We never caught your name," I said, leaning into my husband's side. "You are—" The woman opened her mouth, but no words came out. I waited for her to answer. "Honey," a gruff voice called from the neighbor's doorway. It seemed almost unnaturally loud. Not as if he was yelling, but like his voice was amplified somehow. The woman smiled at us again apologetically. "I must be going," she said, resting her hands on her stomach. "We will have to get together sometime." James and I only had the time to nod before she was turning away, walking quickly back towards who I assumed must be her husband. I saw something move on the second floor of their house, baby blue curtains parting. I looked up and met the eyes of two more children. They appeared to be twin girls, maybe 4 or 5. One of them waved. The other just stared. Embarrassingly enough, we didn't get to eat the casserole until several days later. Those days were full of hauling heavy boxes from our car and putting everything where it belonged. And my ears still rung with the sound of drills as I took the baking dish out of the freezer to thaw. "It'll be nice to eat something other than takeout," James said, sitting at our kitchen table and resting his head in his hands. "Yeah," I replied, "but I'm not sure how I feel about 2-day-old tuna." I walked over, nudging him with my hip. He pulled out his chair, guiding me down on his lap and wrapping his arms around my waist. There was so much excitement in the air as we had set up our new home, but I felt like we hadn't had any time to settle in yet. I had barely been alone with him in any meaningful way. It was the first time since our wedding day that we hadn't been all over each other. He pressed his mouth against my collarbone, trailing his lips up my neck and to my ear. I felt a giggle rise in my chest, running my fingers through his slightly oily hair. "When's the last time you showered?" I teased, and I felt him laugh against my skin. "I was waiting for you, my love." I smiled. "You're disgusting. We'd better hurry up and eat then." The oven dinged, letting me know it was preheated. It took everything in me to get up, off of James. Right as my fingers wrapped around the handle, my other hand reaching for the casserole, I heard something. I froze, tilting my head towards the window. The night was warm and still. I could see warm yellow light glowing in the neighbors' windows. A perfect caricature. "Did you hear that?" My husband didn't seem to be paying attention, fiddling with the loose leg of his chair. "What do you mean?" "I thought I heard something." Before I could dismiss it as delusion, it came again. It was a sound like a cat with its tail being stomped on, a faint, yet blood-curdling screech. I looked closer at the house, but nothing seemed amiss. There was an even louder moaning sound, and then another scream, far clearer this time. "What was that?" James asked, now standing. I shook my head. "I have no idea. Maybe the neighbors are watching a movie." A crash, and another scream. Something moved in one of the windows, and then the curtains were yanked shut. "Should I go and check?" "I can do it." My husband shifted nervously, and I shook my head. He would do it, but I knew he didn't want to. He had always been skittish, especially at night. "I'll go." I grabbed an oven mitt and tossed it at him. It hit his chest and fell to the kitchen floor. "Put in the casserole. I'll be right back." The night felt even more quiet when I stepped outside, almost eerily so. The air felt so heavy and still, like I was standing inside of a painting of a street. My footsteps echoed against the pavement, and I tensed each time another scream rang out from the house. "What the hell?" I muttered, half out of curiosity and half just to hear a human voice. I knocked on the front door 3 times, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. I was already starting to regret coming over here, feeling silly for disturbing their night if it really was nothing. Even their porch was pristine. The white paint looked fresh, and even the dolls and toy cars strewn against the railing looked organized. I heard footsteps, and the front door opened a crack. I caught a glimpse of a man's face, his jaw square and dusted with stubble. "Good evening, Adeline," he greeted me. "Hi," I said, my voice coming out far softer than I meant for it to. "Good evening. I thought I heard something. Is everything okay?" He hesitated, then smiled. It looked a little forced. He opened the door wider, and I had to stop myself from flinching. His white button-down was stained with flecks of blood, bright red and fresh. There was a child clinging to his pant leg, a little boy that I didn't recognize. "Everything is all right," he told me, tussling the boy's hair absent-mindedly. "My wife is just going into labor." "Oh," I exclaimed, blinking at him in shock. He seemed incredibly calm considering the circumstances. "Should we call someone? An ambulance?" "No," he said quickly, his smile fading the tiniest bit. "No, that's quite all right. Thank you for your concern. This isn't her first rodeo, so to speak." He chuckled stiffly. "Oh, okay. Well, tell her congratulations." "Will do." He seemed to look me up and down, and a shiver creeped up my spine. "Well, have a lovely night, and we're so happy you moved in." He went to close the door on me, turning away, but at the last second, the little boy shoved his hand through the crack. A piece of notebook paper fluttered to the slats of the porch, and the door closed with a sharp click. I picked up the piece of paper somewhat stunned, as another scream ricocheted inside my head. I unfolded it slowly, holding it under the porch light and squinting to make out what the shaky scratches of red crayon read. Mommy makes lots of babies. It was only a week later that I got a call on the house phone. I was in the bath, and I ran to the kitchen, a towel wrapped around my waist, and my hair dripping warm water down my back. "Hello," I said into the receiver, clutching the phone with both hands. Somehow I already knew who it would be. "Hello, Adeline." Her voice was just as cheerful as it had been that first day we'd moved in, like a jingling bell hanging from the door of a shop. "How are you, dear?" "I'm fine," I replied, my eyebrows cinching into an involuntary frown. "How are you? How's the baby?" "What?" She sounded genuinely confused, but only for a second. "Oh, the baby is just fine. Such a miracle of life, isn't it?" "Yes, such a miracle. That's amazing. I'm so happy for you." "Yes, so listen. I was hoping you and your husband would come by tonight for a little dinner party. I made tuna casserole. Please, please say you will." I swallowed. Something about her was beginning to unnerve me. Something about how perky she was, only days after labor. But I still didn't want to be rude. And it wasn't like I didn't like her. I didn't want to pass up any friends, especially when they lived just next door. "Of course," I said, hoping she could hear my polite smile. "We'll be there." I clutched my Tupperware of cookies tightly to my chest as James guided me up the front steps. I prayed they wouldn't be able to tell they were store-bought, although I was sure they wouldn't say anything even if they did. James knocked on the door, then tutted and picked at some chipped white paint next to the peephole. "Looks like they need a new paint job out here. Maybe I should offer?" "Babe, that's rude," I told him, a strange feeling twisting in my stomach. Something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Our neighbor threw open the door, beaming at us. She was wearing a pink flowery dress and a white apron. "I'm so glad you could make it. Come on in. Everyone's waiting in the dining room." I couldn't help but stare at her stomach, which seemed almost as large as it had been the day we'd met. I glanced at my husband, but he didn't seem to have noticed anything, and only smiled at me reassuringly. Admittedly, I didn't know as much as I could about childbirth, but I knew your stomach stayed large for at least a few days. Surely her body just hadn't recovered yet. Their dining room was larger than ours, or maybe that was just the way it was decorated. It was minimal. The only personal items I could see were more toys. At their long dining table, there were 6 places set. A little girl sat at one of them, quietly playing with a Barbie doll, and a teenager sat next to her scowling at us. I didn't recognize either of them. This couple seemed so young. How could they have a teenager already? Some people started early, I guess. I had assumed dinner party meant there would be more people, but I felt guilty for assuming that. They were so eager to spend time with us, maybe they just didn't have many other friends, especially with so many children running around. Across from the kids sat her husband, grinning at us. I blinked. He didn't look how I remembered him. Hadn't her husband been a brunette? This man's hair was a lighter brown, almost a dirty blonde, and his face seemed softer. It must have just been the lighting, I told myself. Surely in the dark, his features had just looked bleak and more severe. The woman immediately started bustling around in the kitchen, and James and I took our seats. I stared at the glass of wine already set out in front of me, the dark red liquid reminding me suddenly of that night, of the blood splattered across the man's shirt. James began chatting up the husband, but I couldn't bring myself to keep up. I just stared into the glass, swirling the wine around, watching it lap up against the rim. It was so dark, almost black, we didn't even know these people's names. Were we so rude that we had never asked? Was that a bug? I dipped my finger into my wine and fished out a small fly, still buzzing desperately. Looking around quickly, I flicked it off my finger and to the ground, not wanting to embarrass our hosts. "Such a lovely home," James was saying, and I smiled and nodded as if I had been listening. "Yes," I butt in and then hesitated. "Forgive me, but I've forgotten your name." The man's grin didn't falter. "Joseph," he said happily. "No need to apologize. I'm Joseph." "And your wife?" "Dinner is served," the woman called, interrupting me. She wielded a large dish which gave off a faint fishy aroma, setting it down with a flourish in the center of the table. "Thank goodness, honey, I'm starving." Joseph tucked his napkin into his shirt and picked up his fork and his knife, clutching them in both hands, cartoonishly. I looked at James, searching for any semblance of confusion. I found none, only a polite smile. "This is the children's favorite dish," she told us, taking my husband's plate. "How many kids do you have?" "Here you are, love," she said, scooping a helping of casserole onto his plate and reaching over me to set it down in front of him. As she leaned over me, I caught a glimpse of her face. Her skin seemed to glisten around her eyes like it was wet. "Growing boys need to eat." James chuckled nervously, the first hint I'd gotten of anything amiss. "That's what I keep telling Adeline." Joseph laughed uproariously, pounding his fists on the table. I caught the teenager jump, and the little girl set down her Barbie, but I couldn't decipher the expression on either of their faces. "A man of my own heart," he cried, and he didn't stop laughing. "What did you bring us?" the woman asked after a moment, nodding at the Tupperware, having to raise her voice to be heard over her husband's laughter. I swallowed. "Chocolate chip cookies." "Lovely." I gazed down at the food she'd put in front of me. It smelled even fishier up close, nothing like the first one she'd given us. I picked up my fork, picking at a flaky corner. A fish bone stuck to the prongs, long and slender and sharp. "I hope you'll eat it all," the woman said to me, leaning over so close her blonde curls tumbled onto my shoulder. She smelled of perfume and faintly of fish. Now that she was close to me, I could see clearly that her face was, in fact, wet. "You simply must get used to eating for two." After that dinner, it wasn't that I was avoiding them, but I didn't make much of an effort to get closer. I felt deeply uncomfortable, in a way that I didn't quite like to think about. Even so, I told myself it wasn't them, we just had gotten busy. James had started his new job in the city, starting construction on a new shopping mall, and I had a big interview coming up. I simply didn't have much time to think about our neighbors. Not that they didn't make it difficult not to. Neither of us got much sleep anymore. The sound of a crying baby kept us up and made us restless. They baffled me during the day, too. One Monday before James had gotten home, I noticed a man out in their yard, playing with a few of the children. He was chasing them around the swings, around and around, and they were shrieking with glee. My curiosity got the better of me. Was this an uncle? A babysitter? I knew little to nothing about this family, and I figured that was what was unnerving me so much. Maybe if I knew more, I would feel comfortable living next to them. Before I could stop myself, I walked out, watching them play for another moment before speaking. "Hi," I called out, and all four of them turned to face me. "Hello. I'm Adeline. I live next door." "Sorry to be nosy. I was just wondering, how are you related to the family?" The man smiled at me just like the rest of them, widely. Up close, he looked even older, maybe in his 40s. He must be a relative of some sort. "Don't be sorry, Adeline. I'm their son. We've been so happy that you moved in." After that, I put even more distance between myself and the neighbors. I was sure there was a logical explanation for all of this, but if I thought too hard about it, I felt like my brain would explode. A couple of nights later, James had had enough. "That's it," he muttered against my shoulder, squeezing me from behind. "I'm going over there," I groaned, rolling over and pressing our noses together. Even with my eyes crossed, I could see his dark circles, and his hair stuck up wildly from tossing and turning. "Don't, honey," I whispered, my voice raspy. "It's okay, it's not their fault." "Surely they can do something," he argued, gently running his fingers through my hair despite his abrasive tone. "Jesus, it's almost louder with the windows closed. How many babies do they have over there anyways?" I paused and thought about his question, and I listened. I hadn't realized, but he was right. The crying didn't sound like one infant, it sounded like a whole chorus. "I can do it if you want," I muttered, but he shook his head. "No, it's okay, I'll go. You went last time." He pulled back the covers and got to his feet, reaching for his pants next to the bedside table. I sat up and watched him get dressed. And once he had kissed me and walked downstairs, I stood up to peer blearily through the bedroom window. It was raining that night, the first rain we'd seen since moving in. It made the neighbor's house look much older than it was, almost like a haunted house. In the darkness and the storm, it almost looked dilapidated. I watched my husband tread through the mud, smiling at how goofy he looked, carrying our purple umbrella. I watched him march up the front steps, shaking the water off of himself, and knocking on the front door. I remember it so vividly. It wasn't a dream. I remember him knocking, and then, so quickly it was unnatural, the front door opened. I didn't see who was behind it, but I saw a bright flash of light and heard a deafening gunshot. And my husband fell to the porch. His chest was eviscerated. Blood and guts spewed out on the wood. My husband's warm body still twitching. I remember staring, shaking, in complete shock. I remember seeing curtains parting from the corner of my eye, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from his body. I remember everything going black, like static taking over my vision and falling. I was surrounded by red meat and blood and a sticky white substance. I was naked and wet, and I couldn't move. All my limbs were cramped up against my body. I felt a pull, pulling me, sucking me down into the redness and the darkness. I heard a voice, a woman's voice, muffled and distant, screaming and sobbing. "No, I don't want to, please. I don't want any more." I saw a bright light, and I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My husband sat up next to me, woken no doubt by my violent cries. He pulled me against my chest, stroking my hair, but I wouldn't stop shaking. It's okay, just a dream." But it wasn't just a dream, I saw it. I had seen him die. It had been so real, so vivid. I was still mourning, still in shock, curled up in his lap. It couldn't have been a dream. She brought me a pie the next day, the wife. James had stayed home from work to console me, deeply alarmed by my reaction to what he thought was just a bad dream. He offered to get the door, but I didn't want him to. I didn't want him anywhere near a front door ever again. I turned the knob with shaking hands. And there she stood, her hair tied up in a messy ponytail, clutching a pie tin in front of her. She was still pregnant. She held it out to me, her smile gleaming and wide, but her eyes apologetic. "I wanted to apologize for the noise," she said cheerfully, tilting her head. "I hope it hasn't kept you up. It's just so difficult sometimes with newborns. You of all people would understand." "I don't have kids," I said bluntly, eyeing the pie. It must have been cherry. It was red. So red. "Remember?" She blinked at me. "Oh yes, of course." She held out the pie, pushing it into my hands. "Please take it." I cautiously took it from her. It was so red inside, like the red from my dream, like my husband's guts. When I looked back up, she was still smiling, but there were tears streaming down her face and dripping off her chin. I stared at her blankly. "Are you okay?" "Yes, oh yes, I'm fantastic, dear." Without warning, she opened her arms and pulled me in, hugging me tightly, the pie tin crumbling between us. "We're just so glad you moved in." I heard a sound like water trickling, and I cringed as something wet touched my legs. I pulled back and looked down to see liquid trickling down her thighs, slightly pink and sticky. You She raised her eyebrows inquisitively, then looked down at herself and seemed to blush. Oh my. Yes. You must excuse me. She gave me another smile so wide it looked like it might hurt, still weeping silently. She looked older than before. I'm so sorry again. I'm so sorry. She killed herself a couple of days later. I saw it happen. I felt an urge to look out of our bedroom window around 5 in the morning, and I saw her standing on the roof of the neighbor's house. She seemed to look me right in the eyes before she plummeted. I ran down the stairs as quickly as I could, almost tripping and cracking my head open. When I got outside, everything looked different. The house looked different. Old. Like it hadn't been lived in years. The yard was overgrown, the grass swallowing up the children's toys, and the pink flowers on the windowsills were shriveled and brown. The porch was dirty and packed with things, as if only hoarders had ever resided there. The paramedics came after I called 911 and the police, and it occurred to me that it was the first time I had seen anyone other than us and the neighbors on that street. They told me it was a good thing I had called because no one else would have. When I asked what that meant, they just looked at me blankly. No one else lives here, ma'am, one of them told me, as if it were obvious. I stared at her body until they took her away. She looked different. She looked old. Even so, I could have sworn I saw her stomach growing. I heard them call her Jane Doe as they zipped up the black body bag. That was a few months ago. We moved back into our apartment closer to the city, and even though it's cramped here, it feels so much more comfortable. I've been going to therapy, trying desperately to figure out if what I witnessed was real or pure insanity. My therapist seems to think it was stress. Somehow so does my husband, as if he wasn't there, as if he didn't see what I did. He seems different. I've noticed things, like how the mole on the back of his wrist is gone now, and how his hair grows slightly curly when it used to be so straight. I can't get the image of him that night out of my head. His body destroyed and drenched in gore, his eyes still open. I've been throwing up every morning, but I won't test. I'm terrified to confirm what I already know.